My name is Sandra, and I'm the mother of an 18-year-old college student named Michael. For years, my husband Brian and I have sacrificed everything to secure his education. We've skipped vacations, scrimped on daily comforts, and done everything to ensure Michael has a shot at a brighter future. We live in a small, unassuming house that once belonged to my grandmother before she moved into a nursing home. Brian works tirelessly at a local hardware store, and I juggle my job as a front desk manager at a doctor's office. We live simply, but it's a life that has always felt enough. It all changed one Thursday afternoon. The warm sun filtered through the kitchen window as I prepared dinner. My thoughts were occupied by the usual worries, budgeting groceries, utility bills, when Brian's phone rang. He answered, his voice tinged with concern. "Hello, Mom, slow down, what's wrong?" I watched him pace, his face growing pale as he absorbed the news. When the call ended, he sank onto the couch, looking utterly defeated. "My parents," he began, his voice heavy, "they've lost everything. Their business went under, and the house is gone. They're bankrupt." I set down the spatula, stunned. "Oh, Brian, that's terrible. What are they going to do?" "They want to stay with us," he said reluctantly, "just until they figure things out." The weight of his words pressed down on me. Our budget was already stretched thin, and the thought of having two more people in the house, especially Brian's parents, Terry and Catherine, was daunting. They had always lived extravagantly and looked down on our modest lifestyle. "What did you tell them?" I asked carefully. "I said I'd talk to you first. This is your home too, Sandra. I didn't want to decide without you," he said, running a hand through his hair. I sighed, torn. "They can stay, but it has to be temporary. They'll need to start looking for a place as soon as they settle in." Brian nodded, visibly relieved. He called them back and made it clear they were welcome, but only for a short while. When he hung up, his face was a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "They'll be here next week." The day of their arrival felt like the calm before a storm, as the sound of two large moving trucks rumbling up our driveway shattered the stillness. My heart sank. I stood on the porch, watching in disbelief as workers began unloading what could only be described as a mansion's worth of belongings. "Are they moving in or relocating their entire lives?" I muttered to Brian, who gave me a resigned shrug. Terry emerged first, his booming laughter carrying across the yard as he clapped Brian on the back. "Thanks for opening your doors to us, son. You're a lifesaver." Catherine followed, her perfume hitting me before her air kisses did. "Sandra, dear, thank you for this. You're such a gem," she cooed before directing the movers with the precision of a general. "Just the essentials, I asked, gesturing to the mountain of furniture and boxes being carted inside. "Oh, yes," Catherine replied breezily. "We left most of it in storage." By the time the movers finished, our once cozy home had transformed into a cluttered museum of Terry and Catherine's previous life. Ornate furniture clashed with our simple decor, and I could barely recognize the living room beneath the piles of items labeled fragile. Dinner that night was awkward. We squeezed around the dining table, which was now flanked by their leather chairs and Catherine's essential decorative vases. Terry poured expensive French wine into crystal glasses they'd brought with them. "This is just until we get back on our feet," Catherine assured us, her tone sweet but dismissive. "You'll barely notice we're here." Brian and I exchanged a glance. "We do need to set some boundaries," he began, but Terry waved him off. "Relax, son, we'll make it work." It didn't take long for tensions to rise. A few nights later, I was preparing a simple dinner, spaghetti with marinara sauce, when Catherine sauntered into the kitchen. She wrinkled her nose, inspecting the pot as though it contained poison. "Is that what we're having?" she asked, her voice dripping with disapproval. "Where's the protein, the fresh ingredients?" "It's what we can afford," I replied evenly, gripping the wooden spoon tighter. Catherine sniffed and muttered, "I suppose we'll have to manage." Brian overheard and stepped in. "Mom, this is how we live. If you want something else, you're welcome to cook it yourself." The next day, Catherine handed me a grocery list filled with high-end items, marbled steaks, fresh seafood, exotic cheeses. When I balked, she added, "If you're hosting, you should be able to provide for your guests." Brian and I sat down with them that evening to address the mounting issues. "We can't afford these groceries," Brian said firmly, holding up the list. "Our budget is already stretched." "Maybe you should work harder," Terry snapped, his tone condescending. "Your father worked 2 jobs when we were young." The conversation escalated. their entitlement clashing with our reality. Eventually, we caved, using our limited savings to buy the groceries they demanded. Our simple meals were replaced with luxurious feasts. For them, Brian and I often ate sandwiches or skipped meals to save money. The final straw came one evening when Terry accidentally knocked over my grandmother's antique vase. I rushed into the living room to find him standing over the shattered pieces. "It slipped," he said, his tone indifferent. "This vase was a family heirloom," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "It means more to me than you can imagine." "It's just a vase," Catherine said from the doorway, shrugging. "You can buy another." "That's not the point," I snapped. "This is about respect." Terry raised his voice, glaring at me. "Respect? You've treated us like burdens since we arrived." Brian stepped in, his voice steady but firm. "You're here because we allowed it, but if you can't respect us or our home, maybe it's time to leave." Their silence was icy, but the message was clear. We'd reached our limit, something had to change, and it had to change soon. I set the bag down with deliberate care, even though my frustration was reaching its boiling point. "It's not just the lunch, Catherine," I said, my voice taut with restraint. "It's every unnecessary expense you two have piled on us. We've already explained this more than once, we're sticking to a budget. It's not optional." Catherine's expression hardened instantly, the chill in her gaze palpable. "If you're going to get this worked up over a simple meal," she replied, her tone laced with sarcasm, "then perhaps we won't bother treating anyone next time." Brian, standing beside me, pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture I recognized all too well. It was his way of trying to calm the storm brewing inside him. "This isn't just about a meal," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's about respecting the rules of this house. You can't keep undermining us like this." The conversation spiraled in circles, the same points being rehashed with no resolution in sight. It was like trying to convince a brick wall to bend. Eventually, Terry and Catherine retreated to their room, their departure punctuated by the sharp closing of their door. The untouched, overpriced lunch sat on the dining table, a symbol of the ever-growing rift between us. Brian and I exchanged a look that spoke volumes. We were both at the end of our patience, and something had to give. "I'm going to call the restaurant," I said, already reaching for my phone. "I'll explain the situation and cancel any future orders made without our approval." Brian nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. "Good, and I'll have another conversation with them. This sneaky behavior has to stop, now." The peace that followed was tenuous at best, more of a ceasefire than true resolution. Terry and Catherine simmered with a quiet resentment that hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier with each passing day, as though the walls themselves absorbed the tension. A few days later, just as I was beginning to hope the worst had passed, the fragile calm was shattered once again. I was in the kitchen washing dishes after dinner, the rhythmic sound of running water and clinking plates providing a momentary reprieve. Brian had just come inside from working in the yard, his steps weary and slow. I was about to ask him about his day when a loud crash erupted from the living room. We both froze for a heartbeat before rushing toward the noise. When we arrived, we found Terry standing over the shattered remains of a vase, a family heirloom passed down from my grandmother. Its delicate blue and white patterns were now a mess of jagged shards strewn across the floor. Brian's voice was measured but carried an unmistakable edge. "What just happened?" Terry shrugged, his expression unreadable except for a flicker of defiance. "It slipped out of my hands," he said flatly. There wasn't a shred of genuine remorse in his tone. Brian crouched down to pick up the pieces, his movements careful and deliberate. I stood there for a moment, staring at the wreckage, before the words spilled out of me. "That vase was from my grandmother. It's been in this family for decades. It has more history with this house than any of us." Catherine appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with an air of indifference. "It's just a vase," she said dismissively. "You can always buy another one." My patience, already worn thin, snapped. "That's not the point, Catherine," I said, my voice rising. "This is about respect, something you both seem to lack entirely." Terry's eyes narrowed, his voice rising to match mine. "Respect? How about the way you treat us? You act like we're second-class citizens in our own son's home." Brian stood, the pieces of the vase clutched in his hands. His voice was steady but carried a weight that silenced the room. "You're here because we allowed it, Dad, don't forget that." Catherine's icy demeanor cracked, revealing a sharp edge of bitterness. "It doesn't feel like we're allowed anything. It feels like we're merely tolerated. The tension between us was palpable, like the charged air before a storm. It felt as though we were all teetering on the edge of an explosion. And then, inevitably, the breaking point came. It was during dinner a few nights later, a setting that had become the epicenter of so many arguments. Catherine had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, but as we neared the end, she broke her silence with a request so audacious it left me momentarily speechless. "Brian," she began, her tone overly casual, "I saw a beautiful coat today. I think we should use Michael's college fund to buy it." The room fell silent, save for the faint clink of my fork hitting the plate as I set it down. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Catherine mistook my stunned reaction for agreement. Smiling sweetly, she continued, "It's only money, dear. Michael can take out loans for college. I really do need a new coat." Brian's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he slammed his fork down on the table. "No," he said, his voice sharp and final, "that's not happening. That fund is for Michael's future, not your shopping spree." Catherine's smile vanished, replaced by a look of wounded indignation. "How can you deny your mother something so simple?" "It's not simple," I interjected, my own voice trembling with anger, "and this conversation is over. That money is off limits." Catherine, end of discussion. Terry, who had been quietly watching until now, suddenly exploded. "You're being cruel and unreasonable. We are your family." He jabbed a finger toward Brian. "Maybe the local news would like to hear how you're treating your parents. What would your employers think of that?" I stared at him in disbelief, the sheer audacity of the threat leaving me momentarily speechless. But then, something inside me snapped. "Enough," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "This is our home, and these are our rules. If you can't respect them, then maybe it's time for you to find somewhere else to stay." The room fell silent, the weight of my words settling over us all. Terry and Catherine exchanged a look before silently rising from the table and retreating to their room. Brian reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm, a silent reassurance that we were in this together. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said softly. I nodded, the exhaustion of the evening washing over me. "I am too," I replied, "but it was the right choice. We can't keep living like this."